Hello everyone. In today's video, I want to talk about Brifault's law and its associated corollaries, and I also want to respond to some of the points made by Paul Elam in his recent video on this subject. And then I want to describe why I ultimately agree more with Stardust on the importance of Brifault's law as a concept that men should be familiar with, especially in present times. So I'm going to go ahead and present Brifault's law as it's stated in an article from Dale Hartley in Psychology Today. And it was actually pretty surprisingly hard to find a really succinct, to the point presentation of Brifault's law and its corollaries. And so this is pretty much the best article I could find that actually define what Brifault's law is, along with its corollaries. So Brifault's law maintains, according to the article, that the female, not the male, determines all the conditions of the animal family. Where the female can derive no benefit from association with the male, no such association takes place. Now, the three corollaries to Brifault's law, which apparently came later, although I really don't know whether Briffault himself came up with this or whether this was something that was added by somebody else. The article says Briffault continues with these three corollaries, so I assume that it was part of his thinking as well that he may have added later to this. So the three corollaries are the following. Even though a woman has accrued past benefits from her relationship with a man, this is no guarantee of her continuing the relationship with him. In other words, what have you done for me lately? The second corollary is, if a woman promises a man to continue her relationship with him in the future in exchange for a benefit received from him today, her promise becomes null and void as soon as the benefit is rendered. In other words, I will gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today, which is a reference to an old McDonald's ad, I believe. The third corollary is, a man's promise of a future benefit has limited ability to secure a continuing relationship with a woman, and his promise carries weight with her only to the extent that the woman's wait for the benefit is short and to the extent that she trusts him to keep his promise. So, that is Brifault's law and the three corollaries that go along with the original theory, the original idea. So, I want to make it clear to start off with, guys, that I don't think Paul Elam has a negative intent in his video where he is trying to deconstruct Brifault's law and criticize it. I really wouldn't make any sort of response video, which is essentially what this is, to someone that I didn't think really made content that was in men's interest, or that, is someone that's against the men's community somehow, because I don't really waste my time on that in general. I have made responses to particular feminist arguments before, but for the most part, I'm not even going to have a discussion or response for people that don't really have good intentions or who I think are deliberately being deceitful or anything like that. So that's not how I view Paul's arguments. But in his video, Paul basically spends the first half or so of his message discussing Briffault himself and his background as a simp. The problem here is that this doesn't do much of anything to change the validity of Brifault's law itself. It doesn't matter what someone's background is if that person's observations are ultimately valid or true. We may have less of a tendency to listen to someone if we know that they're usually clueless or unreliable, but that doesn't change whether an idea has value in any particular case. So even if Briffault was a simp or otherwise deficient, it doesn't change anything in terms of the validity of his theory in itself. The focus of our analysis doesn't really change because of this. It's about the case that's being made, not the person that's making the argument. Another problem that I see is that Paul presents Brifault's law without its accompanying corollaries, which is fair to a large extent if you're only looking at the history of Brifault's ideas and how he developed them. However, I think we need to account for these corollaries in order to see the greater context in which Brifault's law applies overall today. This theory is rarely mentioned from what I've seen in the men's community separate from its corollaries, and I think all of it needs to be considered together to understand what it conveys to men now. This is why I included those details in addition to the original Briffault's law content. I think that it all needs to be considered as a whole in order to draw any particular conclusion on its value as men entering the so-called manosphere discover or are introduced to these ideas. So now that I've gotten those basic differences of opinion out of the way, I want to get into the meat of my attempt to defend Briffault's law. The first point that I'd like to make is about the essence of this theory. What does Briffault's law and its corollaries boil down to in terms of their practical application, taken together, like I said, to men today? I would argue that you can convey the idea in one sentence. You can take Briffault's law and its corollaries together and get its essential meaning in just one sentence. Women don't care about the men with whom they form relationships. They care about what those men can do for them. While Briffault's law may have been developed to describe the behavior of other animal species, and that's how it originated, I think its application to men's interactions with women today boils down to this straightforward idea. Again, this consideration is more important, to me at least, than how Briffault originally came up with his theory. The essence of the theory ultimately matters more than its origin. The second point is the language of the theory itself and the idea of benefit. Even if taking a very broad look at what benefit can constitute, I'm not sure that many men actually do benefit from relationships with women. Again, in his video, Paul Elam talked about how, well, everybody does something with the idea of benefit, but I'm not sure that's true. I think a lot of men simply do not think rationally in their dealings with women, and they don't benefit from a lot of the relationships they enter into. I see men often thinking with their little heads and hoping to get some level of sexual gratification by putting time, energy, and resources into a relationship with a woman, while often getting little in return when you look at what benefits that actually yields, if any. I think this difference between perceived benefit and actual benefit is an interesting topic on its own. However, in the context of Briffault's law, I think we can more specifically define the type of benefit Briffault is talking about as utility. In my opinion, it's clear that we're not talking about intangible benefits such as love, loyalty, or emotional support. It's about what a man can materially bring to the table that a woman may see as beneficial. Taking this more specific term of utility into account helps us to determine the type of benefit that I believe is pivotal here. Women typically want to be with men who display utility value above all other types of potential benefit. So there is a specific benefit at play here, and that is a man's utility. This gets to my third point, which is that Briffault's law, taken together with its corollaries, highlights a fundamental difference between male and female nature. While men may at least hope to derive other forms of benefit from a relationship, such as sex or companionship, women tend to value a relationship only for as long as a man's utility value is maximized. Indeed, things like hypergamy, monkey branching, and the frequency by which women file for divorce are a few examples of what happens to a man who thought that the benefit he brought to the table was something intangible and irreplaceable, like a personal connection. I won't say that men never use women in relationships to get sex, but as far as having an entitled expectation of material benefits, women are clearly on the receiving end in general. This difference between the sexes is exactly what Briffault's law is able to highlight, in my opinion. It generally only works one way, with women valuing men almost exclusively for their utility, while men, if they benefit from relationships at all, typically want something else, or they're not really after just getting material value from the woman. And Briffault's law, in my view, clearly illustrates this difference by saying that the woman determines this. The fourth point that I want to make involves the difference between descriptive and prescriptive statements, or ideas. Briefly put, a descriptive statement simply tries to take something into account based on observation. It doesn't try to dictate or even comment on how things should be or ought to be, but only on how things are. A prescriptive statement, though, does exactly that. It tries to illustrate how one should do things or suggest a strategy or course of action based on that idea. In my interpretation, Briffault's law has never been prescriptive in its intent. Thus, its purpose isn't to tell men that they must bring utility value to a woman because that's how the game is played and that's just what you have to do as the man. Instead, it allows men to know what they are up against from a red-pill perspective as opposed to the nonsense that most men are initially taught about relationships. Men are then better equipped to decide to either opt out of relationships entirely or to reject the conventional terms and insist on mutual benefit. This gets into my next point, which is my assertion that men unfamiliar with the impact of Briffault's law are actually much more likely to stay on the so-called plantation. If you still believe that not all women are like that, relationships are about love, and most women just want to find one guy to settle down with for the rest of their lives, you're much more likely to keep buying into the catastrophe that is the modern dating and relationship game. However, as I alluded to, if you realize that the starting point is that women only enter into and remain in relationships where she is going to get the maximum utility value from the man, then you're far better equipped to make a better decision for yourself or to at least know what the rules are before entering into the fray. You're actually much more likely to reject this dynamic if you're familiar with Briffault's law. The final point before I conclude is that in a society that is well-functioning and where men and women generally have healthy relationships, Briffault's law might be mitigated enough that it wouldn't be exceptionally important. If women had to stick with their chosen relationship partners, and men could actually expect a return on their investment, then men being valued as utilities might not be as detrimental as it is, since women would also have duties and responsibilities on their end. The situation could at least be more balanced between the sexes in that way. But unfortunately, that is the opposite of the society we currently have. And like with hypergamy and other negative aspects of female nature, at least in terms of how those attributes affect men, women are given every incentive to act on their darker attributes. So not only does Briffault's law provide the knowledge that women primarily value men for their utility, it provides this information in an environment where there are basically no constraints placed on women who act on these tendencies. Because of all these factors, I have to contend that Briffault's law is indeed one of the most important things for men to understand today, if not the most important consideration outright. Whether Briffault was a simp, or the original intent of his law was to describe other members of the animal kingdom, the value in Briffault's law, as it applies today, cannot be understated. I believe that the vast majority of women do indeed only value men for the benefit that they may receive in a relationship, while the opposite cannot be said, especially when looking at utility value specifically as the benefit that women receive. I also believe that men are far better off realizing what they are up against so that they are equipped to walk away from these expectations and to either demand mutual benefit from a relationship partner or leave the dating and relationship game entirely to pursue their own interests. To state it one more time, the vast majority of women do not care about the men in their lives, but only what those men can do for them. And that is the essence of Briffault's law and the information that it conveys. And again, guys, I think that that's really the heart of the issue, is that you can talk about benefit in sort of an obscure way, but the benefit that women expect and demand in relationships, and that men have no real equivalent expectation for, is this utility value. And yes, that is really the essence, I think. That's what you would observe in the animal community. So even if looking at the origin of Briffault's law, you're not talking about emotions and that kind of stuff. You're talking about what does the male do for the female? What is the utility value of the male member of that species? And even though I don't think the origin of the theory is really that important, because we're not trying to create some sort of dialogue on doing scientific research for humans to see whether this is indeed how women behave, right? It comes down to your interpretation of observable reality, where I see women acting like this all the time. And that benefit is utility, right? That benefit is what can the man do for the woman? And that's really, along with hypergamy and a general sense of solipsism, right? Women only thinking about themselves, not being able to empathize with men, not seeing men necessarily as fully human. That is absolutely what you get. I really don't think that there's anything that's considerably more important than that for men to understand. Women only value what you will do for them. The inverse of that is not really true, right? Men value women for beauty or companionship or whatever the case may be. Different men have somewhat different values or things that they look for a woman or any woman that they'd like to be in a relationship with. But a lot of it is not just based on what do you bring to the table materially? What do you bring to the table in terms of what you're going to do for me? Women absolutely are that way. And so regardless of the origin of Briffault's law, or whether Briffault was a simp, or whether he described what benefit means, and again, especially taken with the corollaries that came after his original theory, it's clear to me that this is exactly how women go about things. And if you're a man today and you think, well, women are just like men, because that's what we're generally taught, right? Women are just like men, and so they want love and companionship and all the stuff they say they want, and you don't look at what they actually do because you're not informed about Briffault's law. You don't realize that women pretty much just pick partners based on what they get out of it. And especially today, they can monkey branch, they can maximize their hypergamy, right? I'm not going to go into those particular terms, that particular terminology, but Briffault's law is a big part of that, realizing that women just care about what you can do for them. Who you are as a person doesn't necessarily matter. It's why women go after assholes. That's why women don't really care about the nice guys or don't even see the nice guy as a relationship option. It's because he doesn't have resources to give her. Your utility value for most women is all that matters. And you need to realize that, I think, to make good decisions for yourself in terms of do you want to have a relationship or not before you can even assess what it is that you want as a man. And for that reason, Briffault's law is invaluable knowledge for men to have today and to be aware of in terms of the information available to them, because otherwise you're going to believe in this whole men and women are the same, or I just need to be a real man, the traditional conservative view of relationships, and that's not going to work. And so I wanted to create the best defense for Briffault's law that I could here in this video, based on all these different things that are important, these different sort of factors to consider, and how, indeed, guys, women don't care about you. They care what you as a man do for them. And the vast majority of women absolutely are that way. The opposite of that cannot be said. Yeah, men think that they benefit from relationships. In many cases, they really don't, in my opinion. But even if there are other benefits involved, it's that utility value that's important to realize. Women don't care about you in relationships. They care about what you can do for them. That's how they see men. There may be some exceptions to that, but that is general female nature. And before you enter the fray and make your own decisions for yourself individually as a man, you need to be aware of this knowledge. And I agree with Stardust that this is probably the most important, or at least one of the most important things for you to know as a man today.